Margaret Collins thought she was stepping into freedom when she left her husband of 33 years. But the man she chose to love next, Daniel Reeves, was hiding a darkness that would turn her search for happiness into a chilling nightmare. Collins had always been the kind of woman people in her neighborhood admired. She kept a tidy home, volunteered at the local library, and raised her children with care and devotion. To anyone looking in from the outside, her life seemed almost ideal. She and her husband Thomas had been married for 33 years, a number that suggested loyalty, stability, and endurance. Yet inside the quiet walls of their house, Margaret carried a secret weariness that no one else could truly see. Over time, her marriage had become more like a business arrangement than a partnership of love. Thomas was dependable, yes, but he was also distant, locked into habits and routines that never changed. Margaret often felt invisible, as if she had faded into the background of her own life. When the children were young, she poured herself into motherhood, always busy with school schedules, sports, and late-night homework sessions. Their energy kept her distracted from the growing emptiness in her marriage, but as the children grew older and eventually left home to build lives of their own, Margaret was left with silence. The once lively home turned into a quiet shell where the television was the loudest sound most evenings. Conversations with Thomas grew shorter, revolving only around bills, groceries, or repairs. She found herself asking whether this was all there was left for her. 30 years of service to a family, followed by a lifetime of quiet resignation. The thought lingered for years before she finally acted on it. Margaret began to imagine what life might feel like if she chose differently. She thought about the trips she had never taken, experiences she had put off, and the passion she hadn't felt in decades. For a long time, she pushed these feelings aside, convinced that leaving after so many years would make her look selfish or ungrateful. But the weight of her unhappiness grew too heavy to ignore. One day, without a dramatic fight or a single harsh word, she packed her belongings, wrote a letter to Thomas, explaining she needed more than the life they had built, and walked out. The front door, the decision shocked nearly everyone who knew her. Friends called in disbelief, asking what had gone wrong. Her children were confused and hurt, unable to understand why their parents' seemingly strong marriage had ended so suddenly. Thomas himself was stunned into silence, unable to process the loss of the woman who had stood by his side for more than 3 decades. But Margaret felt a strange mixture of guilt and freedom. She grieved for the stability she had left behind, yet she also felt a rush of possibility, a spark of excitement at the thought of starting fresh at 50-3. She moved into a small apartment across town, a modest place with creaky floors and thin walls, but it felt like hers. She bought new furniture, chose bright colors that never would have fit into her old house, and even planted flowers on the tiny balcony. For the first time in years, she felt like she was living a life that reflected her rather than a role she was expected to play. She took long walks, joined a local fitness club, and rediscovered hobbies she had abandoned when her children were small. Each day felt like a chance to rediscover who she was beyond being a wife and mother. But beneath the excitement lingered a quiet uncertainty. Margaret had stepped away from a world she had known for most of her adult life, and the future felt both thrilling and terrifying. She longed for connection, for someone to share this new chapter with, someone who could fill the void Thomas never could. She had no idea that this longing would soon lead her into the orbit of a man who seemed to offer everything she had been searching for. In her pursuit of love and freedom, Margaret would unknowingly place herself in the path of someone whose charm concealed a darkness far more dangerous than the loneliness she had left behind. Margaret's new life had barely settled into routine. When she first noticed Daniel Reeves, he worked at the fitness club she had recently joined, a place she had gone to rebuild not only her health, but her sense of confidence. Daniel stood out immediately, not just for his striking appearance, but for the way he carried himself. At 33, he had the easy charm of someone who knew how to draw attention without appearing to try. His smile seemed directed at everyone, but when his eyes met Margaret's, she felt as if she were the only person in the room at first. She dismissed him as a fleeting presence, too young, too different, too much of everything she thought was out of reach. Yet Daniel had a way of making himself impossible to ignore. He remembered her name after their first meeting, asked about her day when she walked in, and offered tips on exercises that made her feel cared for rather than patronized. For a woman who had spent decades fading into the background, these small gestures lit something inside her she hadn't felt in years. He made her feel seen. Their conversations grew longer over time, stretching beyond casual gym talk into personal details. Margaret learned he had moved from city to city, never staying in one place too long. He said it was because he liked adventure and new experiences, and Margaret admired the boldness of a man who wasn't afraid of change. She told him about her decision to leave her husband after 33 years, expecting judgment, but Daniel only nodded as if he understood completely. To him, she wasn't a woman defined by the years she had spent in one marriage. She was someone brave enough to start over. Before long, their relationship spilled beyond the walls of the gym. They went out for coffee, then dinners, and eventually, weekend getaways. Daniel's presence electrified her world. He was spontaneous, surprising her with plans at the last minute, and his energy made her feel younger than she had in decades. Friends who saw them together were startled by the contrast. Margaret, calm and thoughtful, paired with Daniel, bold and impulsive, but she didn't care. For once, she wasn't concerned about appearances. She was chasing happiness, and for a time it felt within reach. Yet beneath the charm, small cracks began to appear. Daniel often spoke of big plans but never followed through, hinted at financial struggles, claiming bad luck had held him back. And Margaret found herself covering meals or lending small amounts of money. It seemed harmless at first. After all, she told herself, relationships required support. But the requests grew more frequent, and the explanations never quite added up. When she asked about his past jobs or family, his answers shifted like sand, never steady enough to hold. Still, she ignored the warning signs, brushing them aside as quirks of a complicated man. There were other moments, too, flashes of temper, that unsettled her. Once, when a waiter got his order wrong, Daniel's smile vanished, replaced by a sharp edge in his voice that made Margaret shrink in her seat. Another time, she caught him staring at her phone when she had left it unattended, his curiosity disguised as a joke. Each time, he smoothed things over quickly, returning to the man who made her laugh and feel alive. She convinced herself that every relationship had its bumps, that these moments didn't outweigh the way he made her heart race, but others noticed what she refused to see. Her daughter questioned why Daniel never seemed to have steady work. Friends whispered about his reputation, muttering that he had left behind debts and strained relationships in other towns. Margaret brushed it off, saying people were jealous of her newfound happiness. She clung to the belief that she had finally found the passion she had been searching for, unwilling to admit that the love story unfolding before her might not be. As perfect as it seemed in Daniel, she saw the promise of freedom and excitement, the very things she had longed for when she left her husband. What she didn't realize was that the same qualities that drew her in the mystery, the unpredictability, the intensity were shadows of something much darker. And soon, those shadows would begin to take shape, forcing her to confront a truth she was not prepared to face. The deeper Margaret allowed Daniel into her life, the more the foundation she thought she had built began to feel uncertain. At first, his unpredictability had been part of his charm, a quality that made her feel she was breaking free from the routine she had left behind. But unpredictability has two faces, and Margaret was beginning to see the side that left her uneasy. Daniel disappeared for hours without explanation, returning with vague stories about helping friends or handling errands in parts of town she had never heard of. He avoided direct questions, and when pressed too hard, his playful charm would fade into irritation, leaving Margaret with a gnawing sense that she had overstepped. One evening, while cleaning the small apartment they now shared, Margaret stumbled across a stack of envelopes, tucked into a drawer Daniel usually kept locked. Curiosity got the better of her, and what she found unsettled her deeply. The letters were notices and paid bills, debt collection warnings, and final demands from landlords in different towns. Each bore a different address, none of which he had ever mentioned to her. It was the first tangible proof that his past was not as clean as he claimed. Margaret put the papers back quickly, her hand shaking, unwilling to confront him directly. She told herself there had to be an explanation, though the pit in her stomach said otherwise. Over the following weeks, her doubts grew harder to ignore. Neighbors hinted at loud arguments they had overheard when Daniel thought no one else was listening. She noticed how his mood could swing from affectionate to cold within minutes, how a smile could vanish if she said the wrong thing or disagreed with him. His temper was sharp and quick, like a flame that burned hot but left behind nothing but ash. Once, she remembered him slamming a door so hard the frame cracked, only to return moments later with flowers, apologizing as if nothing had happened. Margaret's children tried to intervene in their own ways. Her daughter brought up rumors she had heard from acquaintances, stories of Daniel's past girlfriends who had left suddenly, of police reports that never seemed to lead anywhere. Margaret brushed it off, insisting they didn't understand, that they only wanted to see her go back to Thomas. She could not bring herself to admit that the people she loved might be right. To do so would mean facing the truth that she had traded safety for danger, that the new life she had fought so hard to create might already be unraveling. Then there were the bruises. Daniel carried small marks on his arms and ribs that he explained, away with careless stories about accidents at the gym or clumsy falls, but the frequency of them told another story. Margaret began to wonder if the violence he carried inside didn't stop with his temper, if there were fights and encounters in places she would never know about. Every new detail about him seemed to contradict the version of Daniel she had first fallen for. The charm was still there, but it now felt like a mask, a carefully rehearsed performance hiding something far more sinister beneath. Margaret began to keep her own secrets. Todd started setting aside small amounts of money, hiding them in places she thought Daniel would never look. It was a quiet act of preparation, though she hadn't yet admitted to herself what she was preparing for. She told herself it was just in case, just a safety net, but deep down she knew she was building a way out. At night, she lay awake listening to his uneven breathing beside her, wondering who the man next to her really was. The final confirmation came when she overheard a phone call he thought she hadn't noticed. His voice was low, urgent, and laced with anger. The words weren't clear, but the tone chilled her. When she asked about it later, he brushed it off with a laugh, claiming it was just an old friend in trouble. But Margaret couldn't shake the unease. The pieces of the puzzle no longer fit together, and for the first time she admitted to herself that she might not be safe. The realization came too late. By the time Margaret recognized that Daniel's past was darker than she could ever have imagined, she was already too deeply entangled. The man she had believed would bring her freedom and excitement was instead drawing her into a web of danger that would soon close in around her. The night that changed everything began like any other, with the kind of ordinary details that would later haunt investigators. Rain had been falling all day, leaving the streets slick and the air heavy. Margaret returned home from an errand, carrying bags of groceries, trying to focus on simple routines that brought her comfort. Daniel had been restless for days, his mood swinging wildly between affectionate gestures and sharp bursts of anger. That evening, the tension was thick even before the storm outside reached its peak. Neighbors would later recall hearing raised voices muffled through the walls, followed by the sound of something heavy crashing to the floor. Inside the small apartment, the fragile balance between them finally shattered. Margaret had discovered withdrawals from her bank account she hadn't authorized. Large sums of money gone without explanation. When she confronted Daniel, his charm no longer surfaced to smooth things over. Instead, his anger rose quickly, fueled by her defiance. Margaret, who had spent months ignoring her instincts, finally demanded answers. What happened next unfolded in a matter of minutes. Yet the brutality of it would leave a permanent scar. Furniture was overturned as the confrontation escalated. Glass shattered, leaving fragments scattered across the floor. The struggle moved through the apartment, leaving behind a trail of chaos that told its own silent story. Margaret's determination to stand her ground clashed with Daniel's fury, and for the first time she saw the full extent of the darkness she had sensed beneath his surface. When her daughter tried to reach her that evening, the unanswered calls were the first sign that something was wrong. Hours passed with no reply, an absence that grew more alarming with each attempt. Finally, unable to ignore the dread settling over her, she contacted police to request a welfare check. Officers arrived late into the night, the storm still raging, and were met with an eerie silence when they knocked on the apartment door. Inside, the scene was devastating. The signs of a violent struggle were impossible to miss. Chairs were toppled, groceries lay crushed on the floor, and streaks across the carpet hinted at the desperate fight that had taken place. The officers moved cautiously through the apartment, their flashlights cutting across the wreckage until one beam landed on the basement door. What they found there would remain seared into their memories. Margaret's body was discovered hidden among boxes and discarded belongings, her lifeless form bearing the unmistakable evidence of a violent end.
Ow!
The brutality shocked even those who had spent years on the force. It was not a crime of passion alone, but an eruption of rage so intense that it seemed to consume everything in its path. Daniel Reeves was gone, leaving behind only destruction and silence. Word of the discovery spread quickly, rippling through the community that had once admired Margaret for her stability and devotion. Friends and neighbors struggled to reconcile the woman they knew with the grim reality of her final hours. Her children, devastated, found themselves replaying every warning sign, every uneasy feeling, wishing they had been able to stop what had happened. Detectives wasted no time in naming Daniel as the prime suspect. His history, once hidden in shadows, began to surface in the cold light of investigation. Records revealed a trail of failed relationships, unpaid debts, accusations of violence that painted a chilling picture of a man who had perfected the art of hiding his true nature. The mask of charm he wore so convincingly had slipped completely, revealing the predator beneath. The search for Daniel stretched into the night and beyond, each hour adding urgency to the manhunt. Authorities alerted neighboring states, circulated his photo, and pieced together the fragments of his movements. For investigators, it was clear that this was not a man who would turn himself in willingly. He had vanished into the storm, leaving behind a crime scene that spoke louder than words ever could for Margaret's family. The apartment that had once symbolized her independence became a place of unbearable sorrow. The home she had chosen as her fresh start was now marked forever by violence. What she had hoped would be a chapter of freedom and discovery had ended in the very opposite: confinement, fear, and silence. And as Daniel remained at large, the danger he represented loomed over them all, an unfinished story that left the community gripped by fear and disbelief. In the days following Margaret's death, the search for Daniel Reeves consumed investigators. His face appeared on news broadcasts, his name circulated across state lines, and tip lines buzzed with sightings that led nowhere. Each day that passed without an arrest deepened the fear among those who knew Margaret, and the grief of her family only grew sharper. For them, justice was the only comfort left to cling to. Yet justice seemed elusive as Daniel slipped further from view. Detectives began reconstructing his movements in the weeks before the crime, uncovering patterns that told a story Margaret had never fully seen. Financial records revealed transfers from her accounts to places he had no reason to be. Witnesses came forward to describe a man who often spoke of escaping obligations, of reinventing himself wherever he went. One former landlord described him as charming at first, but quick to anger when pressed for rent. An ex-girlfriend revealed she had once taken out a restraining order after an explosive confrontation. Piece by piece, the picture formed of a man who moved through lives like a shadow, leaving behind wreckage in his wake. Meanwhile, investigators tracked Daniel's most recent movements. Surveillance footage placed him at a bus terminal the night of the storm, carrying a duffel bag and boarding a coach headed out of state. From there, the trail grew faint. He paid for tickets in cash, used false names, and avoided places with cameras. It was a calculated effort to vanish, and for a time, it seemed to be working. But no disguise could last forever, and Daniel carried with him the arrogance of someone who believed he could outsmart everyone else. 3 weeks later, a breakthrough came. A tip from a motel employee in another state led officers to a room registered under a false identity but occupied by someone who matched Daniel's description. When authorities arrived, they found him attempting to leave through a back exit, carrying the same duffel bag he had taken the night he fled. Inside the bag were Margaret's missing credit cards, identification documents in multiple names, and several $1,000s in cash. The evidence tied him directly not only to her murder, but to a pattern of deception that stretched across years. The trial that followed gripped the community. In the courtroom, prosecutors laid out the story with unflinching detail. They described how Daniel had targeted Margaret at a vulnerable time, how he had built trust only to exploit it, and how, when confronted, he had turned violent. Photographs of the crime scene, financial records, and testimony from past partners painted a portrait of a man whose dark side had always been present, hidden behind a carefully maintained mask of charm. Margaret's children sat through every day of proceedings, their grief visible, but their determination stronger still. The defense attempted to paint Daniel as misunderstood, a man with a troubled past who had acted in a moment of passion, but the weight of evidence was overwhelming. Witness after witness testified to his history of manipulation, his bursts of rage, and his calculated lies. When the jury finally returned with a verdict of guilty on all counts, the courtroom was silent except for the muffled sobs of Margaret's family. Daniel Reeves was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, his freedom stripped away as decisively as he had once stripped it from Margaret, for the community. The trial's end brought some measure of closure, though. Nothing could erase the tragedy that had unfolded. Margaret's story became a warning whispered among neighbors, a reminder that appearances can deceive and that danger can hide behind even the most flattering smile. She had left behind a long marriage in search of passion and freedom, believing she was beginning a new chapter. Instead, she encountered a darkness that consumed her life. Her children would later describe her as a woman who loved deeply, who longed for joy after years of quiet sacrifice. They chose to remember her not for the violent way she died, but for the warmth she had given throughout her life. Still, the lesson lingered, unspoken yet powerful. Sometimes the greatest risks are not the leaps we take into the unknown, but the people we choose to trust along the way.